My mother-in-law forbade me from traveling with the whole family because she's jealous of her own son, who happens to be my husband. Looking back, I should have seen the red flags during the wedding planning. My mother-in-law had opinions about everything from flowers to the font on invitations. When I politely incorporated some suggestions and declined others, she gave me this frozen smile that was all teeth and no warmth. The kind that looks fine from across the room but up close feels like a warning. She told me I was sweet, but clearly didn't understand how their family did things. My husband just shrugged and said his mom was traditional. That word would haunt me. The annual family trip came up about 3 months after the wedding. Everyone gathered at our place for Sunday dinner, and my mother-in-law announced the dates like she was revealing the release of a highly anticipated movie. Her husband had already secured the cabin in the mountains, the same one they rented every year for the past 2 decades. My sister-in-law looked excited, her kids were bouncing in their seats, and my brother-in-law was already talking about the fishing spots he wanted to try. I started mentally preparing my time-off request when my mother-in-law looked directly at me and said, with that same tight smile, that the cabin only had 4 bedrooms, and it was really a trip for family. Real family. She actually said that. When I didn't immediately understand what she meant, she clarified in front of everyone that daughters-in-law weren't really part of the family until they produced grandchildren. Her exact words were, "Until you give us grandbabies, you're technically still an outsider." The room went silent. You could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the sound of someone's fork scraping against their plate. My sister-in-law suddenly found her plate fascinating, cutting her chicken into smaller and smaller pieces like she was performing surgery. My brother-in-law coughed awkwardly and took a long drink of water. My father-in-law looked uncomfortable but said nothing, just shifted in his chair and cleared his throat. The kids, sensing the tension, had gone quiet too, which was unusual for them. And my husband, the man who had stood at an altar just 3 months earlier and promised to forsake all others, looked at me with this apologetic expression that made my stomach drop and said his mom paid for the cabin rental, so it was her call. As if financial contribution trumped basic human decency. As if our marriage vows came with an asterisk that said, "Unless mom disagrees." I could have made a scene. I could have stood up right there at the dinner table and listed every single way this was wrong, every violation of basic respect, every example of how absurd it was to tell someone they weren't family 3 months into a legal marriage. I could have demanded he defend me, could have turned to my husband, and made him choose right then and there between his mother's outdated rules and his wife's dignity. I could have walked out right then, called a lawyer, started divorce proceedings before the ink on our marriage certificate was even properly dry. Instead, I smiled, nodded, and said I understood completely. I even helped them finish planning the trip, suggesting hiking trails I had researched when I thought I was going, reminding them to pack the good cooler because the old one had a broken latch, offering to watch their houseplants while they were gone, even though I apparently wasn't family enough to watch the sunset with them. My mother-in-law looked almost disappointed that I didn't fight back. She wanted the confrontation, the drama, the chance to paint me as the difficult daughter-in-law who caused problems and couldn't respect family traditions. I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Not yet, anyway. The morning they left, I waved from the driveway. I had woken up early to make sure they had coffee and breakfast ready, playing the perfect daughter-in-law right until the end. My husband kissed my cheek and whispered that he would miss me, which would have been sweet if he wasn't actively choosing his mother over his wife. If he had actually missed me, he could have insisted I come along. If he had actually valued me, he would have told his mother where she could shove her rules about grandchildren determining family status. But he didn't. So I smiled and waved as they loaded up their 3 cars with enough camping gear and supplies to survive a month in the wilderness, even though they were only going for a week to a fully equipped cabin with electricity and running water. I watched their 3 cars disappear down the street, my husband's hand waving out the window like he was heading off to war instead of a voluntary vacation that excluded his wife. I waited exactly 5 minutes to make sure no one forgot anything and came back for their sleeping bag or their special pillow or whatever item they suddenly remembered as essential. Then went inside and called my best friend. She answered on the second ring. I told her everything, and before I even finished, she was pulling up flight options on her laptop. 2 hours later, we had round-trip tickets to Maui, a beachfront resort with a spa that had ratings so high they seemed fake, and a convertible rental car. My family trip budget, which I had dutifully saved up, was going to give me the vacation I actually deserved. The cabin they were staying in had spotty cell service. The resort I checked into had Wi-Fi so fast I could stream movies in the bathtub. They were dividing up chores and arguing about coffee filters. I was getting a massage from Leilani while someone brought me coconut water served in an actual coconut shell. My best friend and I spent the first day on the beach doing absolutely nothing, and I barely thought about them when I ordered my third cocktail that cost more than their entire grocery budget. I thought about them briefly and went back to not thinking about them. Then my phone started blowing up. It was day 3 of both trips. I was floating in the resort pool when I noticed 12 missed calls, 17 text messages, 3 voicemails, all from my husband. The panic in his voice was obvious. He needed me to go to his home office, find specific contracts, scan documents, and email them immediately. A major deal was falling apart. Here's where I could have been the bigger person. I could have rushed back, saved his deal, proven myself indispensable. Instead, I texted back that I was unavailable and unable to help. I didn't say where I was. I didn't explain. I just said I couldn't do it. Then I ordered another drink and turned my phone off completely. My best friend asked if I was sure, and honestly, I wasn't. But I was tired of being sure, of being accommodating, of bending myself into shapes that made everyone else comfortable while I suffocated. So I stayed in the pool, and later we went snorkeling. And I saw a sea turtle that was probably 100 years old and looked way more peaceful than anyone in my husband's family. When I finally turned my phone back on that evening, there were 43 new messages. Most were from my husband, progressively more desperate. But there were also messages from my mother-in-law, which was interesting since she had made it clear I wasn't family enough to vacation with them. She demanded I return home immediately to handle this. She said I was being selfish and childish. She said this was exactly why she had concerns about me joining the family. The irony was completely lost on her. But there was one message that stood out. It was from my sister-in-law. We had always been cordial, but never particularly close. She had 3 kids and seemed perpetually exhausted, and I had assumed she agreed with her mother's assessment of me. Her message was short, but it hit like a truck. Last year, she told me the same thing. I wasn't invited until I had kids. She said I wasn't really family yet. I'm sorry I didn't say anything at dinner. I should have. I read that message about 15 times. My best friend read it too, and we just stared at each other. This wasn't about me specifically. This was a pattern. This was a system. My mother-in-law had done this before, would probably do it again with the next daughter-in-law who came along. I wasn't being hazed or tested. I was being systematically excluded and diminished, and apparently everyone just went along with it because that was easier than confronting her. I called my sister-in-law. It took 3 attempts before she answered, and when she did, I could hear kids yelling in the background and my mother-in-law's voice asking who she was talking to. She told her mother-in-law it was a friend from work, which was technically true if you stretch the definition of friend, then stepped outside the cabin. I could hear gravel crunching under her feet, the sound of wind through trees, the distant noise of the kids getting fainter. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and tired, like she had been carrying a heavy weight for a very long time and was finally ready to set it down. We talked for nearly an hour. The story she told me made my blood run cold, and my hands shake so badly I had to put the phone on speaker and set it down on the table. Her first year of marriage, she experienced the exact same exclusion. She had accepted it quietly, just like I almost did, thinking it was some weird tradition she needed to endure. But it didn't stop there. My mother-in-law had made her life miserable in 1,000 small ways. Criticizing her parenting, showing up unannounced, rearranging her kitchen when she babysat, commenting on her weight after each pregnancy. The real revelation was about my brother-in-law's first wife, a woman I had heard about only in vague terms. No one in the family talked about her much. According to my sister-in-law, that first wife had been destroyed by my mother-in-law's campaign against her. She had been accused of infidelity based on completely fabricated evidence. My mother-in-law had hired someone to follow her, had manipulated photos to look incriminating, had systematically turned the entire family against her. The accusations were eventually proven false, but by then the marriage was over and the poor woman had suffered a complete breakdown. She spent 3 years in therapy recovering from what was essentially psychological warfare. My sister-in-law spoke in this flat, exhausted voice like she was confessing something she had carried too long. She said she stayed quiet because she had kids and feared what my mother-in-law might do if challenged. She said she watched her mother-in-law start circling me like prey the moment my husband and I got engaged. She said she was sorry. But sorry didn't really cut it when she had watched me walk into the same trap and said nothing. We talked about what to do. She wasn't ready to make waves, not with 3 kids depending on her keeping the peace. But she gave me something valuable. Validation that I wasn't crazy, wasn't overreacting, wasn't the problem. Whatever I decided to do, I wouldn't be alone in knowing the truth. That was something. The next day, my best friend and I went hiking to a waterfall. The trail was steep and I was not in hiking shape, but when we reached the top and saw that water cascading down into a perfect clear pool, something shifted in my chest. I had spent 3 months trying to fit into a family that had no intention of accepting me. I had bent and accommodated and smiled through discomfort. For what? So I could be excluded, then expected to drop everything when they needed me? I made a decision on that hike. I was going back, but I wasn't going back as the same person who left. I was going back with boundaries, with evidence, with a spine made of steel. My mother-in-law wanted to play games? Fine. But she was about to learn that I was a much better player than she anticipated. The rest of the vacation was bittersweet. I couldn't fully relax knowing what was waiting for me at home. My best friend kept trying to distract me with activities and spa treatments, and I appreciated it, but my mind was already 3 steps ahead, planning conversations and anticipating reactions. On our last night, we sat on the beach watching the sunset, and she asked me if I was sure I wanted to go back at all. It was a valid question. My husband had shown me exactly where I ranked in his priorities, and it wasn't first place. But here's the thing about cutting your losses and running. Sometimes it's the right move, but sometimes it's letting the bullies win. I didn't want to be another woman destroyed by that family's dysfunction. I wanted to be the woman who faced it head-on and came out stronger. Naive? Maybe. Optimistic? Definitely. But I was 28 years old, and I had just spent a week in paradise remembering what it felt like to be treated well. I wasn't ready to give up on that feeling. My husband met me at the airport. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept properly in days. He probably hadn't. The client deal had fallen apart spectacularly without those documents. He was facing a potential lawsuit and the loss of his biggest account. He hugged me at baggage claim, and I could feel him shaking slightly. Part of me felt guilty. Part of me felt vindicated. Most of me just felt tired. We didn't talk much in the car. He asked about my trip, and I said it was fine. He tried to explain about the documents, and I said I understood. Everything was very polite and very cold. When we got home, he finally asked where I had been. I told him Maui. His face went through about 5 different expressions in 3 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, anger, hurt, and finally resignation. He asked why I didn't tell him, and I asked why it mattered. He said he needed me here, and I said his mother made it clear I wasn't needed anywhere near the family. He said that was different, and I asked him to explain exactly how it was different. He couldn't. We went to bed in separate rooms that night. The next week was tense. My husband was dealing with the fallout from his work disaster. I was going through the motions of normal life while internally preparing for the conversation I knew was coming. His parents were due back from the cabin trip on Saturday. My mother-in-law had sent me exactly 3 messages during their trip. One demanding I help my husband, one calling me irresponsible, and one that simply said, "We need to talk when I get back." I didn't respond to any of them. Saturday came. My husband was jumpy all morning, clearly anxious about his parents' return. Around 2 in the afternoon, his father called. Not his mother, his father. He asked if he could come by alone to talk to me. My husband looked panicked, but I agreed. An hour later, my father-in-law was sitting in our living room holding a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. He apologized. It was the last thing I expected. This man who had been silent at that dinner table, who had watched his wife exclude me and said nothing, sat in my living room and apologized. He said he had failed me, failed his son, failed every woman who had married into their family. He said he had enabled his wife's behavior for 35 years because it was easier than confronting her. He said he watched what happened to his son's first wife and did nothing. He said he watched his current daughter-in-law suffer and did nothing. He said he wasn't going to watch it happen to me without at least acknowledging his part in it. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to rage at him for all those years of silent complicity. Part of me appreciated that he was finally saying something. Mostly, I just felt sad that it took this long. He asked me not to give up on his son yet, said that my husband was raised in a dysfunctional dynamic and didn't know how to break free from it but was trying. I told him trying wasn't enough anymore. Action was required. Real, concrete, sustained action. He nodded like he expected that answer. Then he said something that changed everything. "She's planning to push you out. She's done it before and she'll do it again unless someone stops her. I can't stop her alone, but maybe together we can." When my mother-in-law returned later that evening with my husband's brother and his family in tow, she walked into our house like she owned it. Didn't knock, just used the key my husband had given her years ago. She found me in the kitchen making dinner, and her opening line was, "I hope you're proud of yourself." No hello, no how are you, just immediate attack mode. I took a deep breath, turned off the stove, and told her we needed to have a family meeting. She laughed and said we certainly did. She called everyone into the living room like she was convening a court. My husband, his father, his brother, his sister-in-law, and even the 3 kids who were quickly shuttled off to the basement playroom. My mother-in-law sat in the center of the couch like a queen on her throne. I stood. I had rehearsed this speech in my head about 1,000 times on the beach in Maui in the shower while pretending to sleep. I told them about the exclusion, about the expectation that I help my husband while being told I wasn't family, about the message from my sister-in-law revealing this was a pattern. I told them I knew about the first wife, about the accusations and the surveillance and the psychological torture. I told them I wasn't going to be another casualty of this family's toxic dynamic. My mother-in-law tried to interrupt about 6 times. Each time, my father-in-law told her to let me finish. She looked at him like he had betrayed her on a fundamental level. Maybe he had. Maybe that's what growth looks like sometimes. When I finished, I laid out my terms clearly and firmly. I would no longer attend any family function where I was treated as less than a full member of the family, where my presence was conditional or grudging or dependent on whether I had produced the required grandchildren yet. I would not be helping anyone who couldn't respect me as an equal human being, deserving of basic consideration. I would not be accepting any behavior that diminished or excluded me based on arbitrary standards that seemed to change whenever it was convenient. And if my husband couldn't support these boundaries, if he couldn't stand beside me and defend my right to be treated with respect, then we had bigger problems than his mother's control issues, and we needed to address those problems sooner rather than later. These weren't threats or ultimatums designed to manipulate anyone. They were simply the terms under which I was willing to continue being part of this family dynamic. The silence that followed was deafening. My brother-in-law looked at the floor. My sister-in-law had tears running down her face. My father-in-law nodded slowly. My husband stared at me like he had never seen me before. And my mother-in-law turned bright red, stood up, and told me I was being dramatic and disrespectful. My husband stood up too. For a horrible moment, I thought he was going to side with her. Then he looked at his mother and said, "She's right." Just those 2 words. But they were everything. His mother's face went from red to purple. She demanded he take it back. He said he couldn't take back the truth. She turned to her husband for support, and he said, "Sit down, dear. We're not done talking." She didn't sit down. She grabbed her purse, told her older son she was leaving, and he better come with her if he knew what was good for him, and stormed out. My brother-in-law looked torn for about 30 seconds, then followed her out. His wife stayed, sitting on the couch crying quietly. My father-in-law just shook his head and said, "Well, that went better than expected." The next few weeks were chaos. My mother-in-law launched a full-scale campaign to turn extended family against me. Aunts and uncles I barely knew were calling my husband to express concern about his marriage. Cousins were sending messages about respecting elders. The family gossip chain was working overtime with increasingly distorted versions of what actually happened. According to some versions, I had physically attacked my mother-in-law. According to others, I was having an affair and using this drama to cover it up. The creativity was almost impressive. My sister-in-law called me about a week after the confrontation. She apologized for not backing me up more vocally during the meeting. She said she was paralyzed by years of conditioning to never contradict her mother-in-law. But she was done being silent. She had spent the week talking to her husband about setting their own boundaries, and he was finally starting to understand the damage his mother's behavior had caused. It wasn't a full transformation, but it was a start. Then she told me something that made me almost drop the phone. She had reached out to the first wife, the woman who had been destroyed by my mother-in-law's false accusations. It took some work to find her, as she had moved states and changed her name, but social media eventually connected them. The woman had been hesitant to engage at first, but when my sister-in-law explained that another woman was going through similar treatment, she agreed to talk. I called her. The conversation lasted 3 hours and left me emotionally wrecked. Sitting on my bathroom floor with tears streaming down my face and my best friend sitting beside me holding my hand. This woman, who now went by a different name and had rebuilt her entire life from scratch in a city 2,000 miles away from anyone who knew her before, shared her story with a mixture of pain and hard-won peace. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. She told me about the surveillance, about coming home to find someone had been through her things, about the feeling of being watched everywhere she went. She told me about the manipulated evidence, photographs taken from angles that suggested intimacy, where there was only innocent conversation with a male coworker. She told me about the systematic poisoning of every relationship she had with the family, how my mother-in-law would pull each person aside and share her concerns in a way that sounded like worried caring but was actually calculated destruction. She had been completely isolated before being pushed out entirely. The divorce had been brutal, with my mother-in-law coaching her son through every step of making it as painful as possible. The aftermath had nearly killed her, literally. She had attempted suicide twice before finally getting into intensive therapy. But here's what stuck with me most. She said the worst part wasn't what my mother-in-law did to her. It was that everyone else let it happen. Her ex-husband, her ex-father-in-law, her ex-brother-in-law, they all watched it unfold and did nothing. Some felt guilty later, but guilt without action is just another form of complicity. She told me that if I had any chance of surviving this family, I needed to be willing to burn it all down if necessary. Half measures would only prolong the torture. I asked her if she would be willing to talk to the family, to tell them directly what had happened to her. There was a long pause. Then she said she would think about it. Her therapist had told her that confronting her abusers might be cathartic, or might be re-traumatizing, and she needed to be sure she was strong enough. I told her I understood and would respect whatever she decided. 3 days later, she called back. She would do it, but only under specific conditions. It would be at a neutral location, her current husband would be there for support, and she reserved the right to leave at any time. I agreed immediately and started planning what would either be the family meeting that changed everything or the final explosion that ended my marriage. I invited everyone to a restaurant, a nice Italian place with private dining rooms. My father-in-law helped me coordinate, making sure everyone would be there, including my mother-in-law, who apparently thought this was some kind of apology session. My brother-in-law and his wife agreed to come after I promised them this was important. I didn't tell anyone about the special guest. The night of the dinner, everyone showed up right on time, which itself was unusual for this family that treated punctuality as a suggestion rather than a commitment. My mother-in-law was dressed like she was attending a formal event at a country club, clearly expecting some kind of public reconciliation where I would grovel, and she would magnanimously forgive me. She had this smug expression, lips curved up but eyes cold, like she'd already scripted how this evening would go and was just waiting for me to play my part. She kept smoothing down her dress and checking her reflection in the dark windows of the restaurant. Everyone took their seats around the large table, and there was awkward small talk for a few minutes about traffic and whether anyone had tried the restaurant's famous tiramisu. Then the door opened again, and a woman I had only spoken to on the phone walked in with her husband beside her, his hand protective on her lower back. The reaction was immediate and visceral. My father-in-law went pale. My brother-in-law actually gasped. My mother-in-law's face went through a rapid series of expressions before settling on barely controlled rage. My husband, who had only heard about his brother's first wife but never met her, looked confused until his brother whispered her name. She sat down calmly, her husband beside her, and introduced herself by her current name. She thanked everyone for coming and said she was here to tell her story one final time. Not for their benefit, but for her own closure, and to potentially save another woman from the same fate. Then she spoke for 40 minutes straight, detailing everything. The surveillance that tracked her every move, the photographs taken out of context and manipulated to suggest infidelity. The lies spread through the family about her character. The systematic destruction of her relationship with her then-husband, who believed his mother over his wife at every turn. The brutal divorce proceedings where she was painted as unstable and unfaithful. The aftermath where she lost everything, including her sense of self. She pulled out a folder of documents. Therapy records showing her diagnosis of complex PTSD directly linked to emotional abuse. A letter from the investigator her ex-mother-in-law had hired, apologizing years later for participating in the harassment and confirming there had never been any evidence of infidelity. Text messages from my mother-in-law to her son during their marriage, explicitly strategizing how to drive a wedge between them. She had kept everything, and now she was laying it all out for everyone to see. My mother-in-law tried to leave. My father-in-law, in probably the strongest moment I had ever witnessed from him, stood up and blocked the door. He told his wife to sit down and listen to what she had done. She refused. He said if she walked out that door, he was filing for separation. The room went dead silent. After 35 years of marriage, he was finally drawing a line. She sat down, but she wouldn't look at anyone. Just stared at the wall with her jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack. The first wife continued. She talked about the 3 years of intensive therapy it took to recover, the medication for anxiety and depression, the trust issues that nearly destroyed her second marriage before it even started, the permanent damage done by someone who was supposed to be family. When she finished, she looked directly at my mother-in-law and said, "I forgive you, but only because holding on to anger was killing me. But forgiveness doesn't mean what you did was okay. It means I'm choosing to live free of you." Then she turned to me and said, "Don't let her do to you what she did to me. Set your boundaries now and never compromise them." These people will only change if there are real consequences. She stood up, thanked us for listening, and left with her husband. The entire room stayed frozen for a good minute after she was gone. My brother-in-law was crying. Actually crying. He said he had been young and stupid when his first marriage fell apart, and he believed his mother's lies because it was easier than confronting the truth. He said he failed his first wife completely and lived with that guilt every day. He said he wouldn't fail his current wife, and he wouldn't fail me. He looked at his mother and said he was ashamed to be her son. My sister-in-law spoke up next, her voice shaking but determined. She detailed her own experiences, the years of subtle and not-so-subtle abuse, the criticism of her parenting that left her doubting every decision, the invasion of privacy disguised as helping, the comments about her appearance that fed into postpartum depression. She said she stayed silent to protect her kids, but she was done protecting them from the truth. They needed to see that standing up to abuse was possible. My father-in-law went last. He apologized to his son's first wife, even though she wasn't there to hear it. He apologized to his current daughter-in-law for all the years of suffering. He apologized to me for not stopping this before it started with me. He said he had been a coward, choosing peace over justice, and he was done being a coward. He looked at his wife and said he loved her but couldn't love what she had become. He was moving out until she got serious professional help, and if she refused, the separation would become permanent. My mother-in-law finally spoke. She said we were all being dramatic and turning on her unfairly. She said she had only ever tried to protect her family from unsuitable women. She said everything she did was out of love, and if we couldn't see that, we were the ones with the problem. Zero accountability, zero remorse, just deflection and justification. It was almost impressive in its complete lack of self-awareness. I told her I had one requirement: 6 months of intensive therapy with a licensed professional who specialized in family dynamics and controlling behavior. After 6 months, if her therapist felt she had made genuine progress, we could attempt supervised family mediation. Until then, I would not be attending any events she was at, and I expected my husband to support that boundary. If he couldn't, I would be filing for divorce. My husband looked at me, looked at his mother, and said, 6 months is generous. I was thinking a year. His mother's face crumpled. She tried to appeal to him, reminding him she was his mother. She raised him. She loved him. He said, then prove it by getting help. She left without another word. My brother-in-law and his family left separately, discussing their own boundaries. My father-in-law stayed, looking exhausted but somehow lighter. He said he should have done this decades ago and thanked me for forcing the issue. I told him I didn't force anything, I just refused to be silent. Sometimes that's the same thing. The fallout was spectacular. My mother-in-law sent a letter 2 days later, filled with deflection and non-apology apologies. She said she was sorry we felt hurt, but maintained she did nothing wrong. She said therapy was for people with actual problems, and her only problem was ungrateful family members. She sent this letter to everyone, apparently thinking it would make her look better. It had the opposite effect. Extended family members started reaching out, not to criticize me, but to share their own stories of my mother-in-law's behavior over the years. Apparently, she had a decades-long pattern of driving away anyone who didn't submit to her control. Former friends, distant relatives, neighbors, even her own siblings had distanced themselves over the years. The family reunion picture had gotten smaller and smaller, and everyone had just accepted it as normal, rather than recognizing the pattern. My husband's work situation remained a disaster. He lost the client and faced a lawsuit that took months to resolve. It was financially devastating and professionally humiliating. There were moments when I could see him resenting me for not helping when he called from the cabin, and there were moments when I resented him for putting me in that position in the first place. Marriage counseling became non-negotiable, and we found a therapist who didn't let either of us off the hook. My father-in-law moved into a small apartment and filed for legal separation. He said he hoped his wife would do the work and they could reconcile, but he wasn't waiting around to find out. He had wasted enough of his life enabling dysfunction. My mother-in-law apparently told everyone he was having a midlife crisis and would come crawling back. 2 months in, he was still in the apartment and seemed happier than anyone had seen him in years. My brother-in-law and his wife started their own therapy, both individual and couples. They set written boundaries with his mother. No unannounced visits, no undermining parenting decisions, no critical comments about appearance or lifestyle, and consequences for violations. My mother-in-law tested these boundaries within a week and found herself banned from seeing her grandchildren for a month. The tantrum that followed was apparently legendary. The 6-month deadline I had set passed with no movement. My mother-in-law refused therapy, calling it a scam and insisting there was nothing wrong with her. She spent those months trying to recruit family members to intercede on her behalf, but the testimonies from the dinner had spread through the family like wildfire. Even her most loyal defenders had heard enough stories to question her narrative. She found herself increasingly isolated, which she blamed on everyone but herself. Month 7 rolled around and something shifted. My father-in-law filed for divorce. Not separation, divorce. My mother-in-law apparently had a breakdown. Calling him screaming and sobbing, he told her he would drop the divorce proceedings if she started therapy immediately and maintained it for at least a year. She said he was abandoning her when she needed him most. He said she abandoned their family years ago by choosing control over connection. She started therapy. Not because she wanted to change, but because she didn't want to lose her husband. Her therapist, bless her, didn't let her get away with victim narratives. Within 2 sessions, it was clear this wasn't going to be a quick fix. The therapist wanted to see her twice a week minimum and required family sessions as part of the treatment. My mother-in-law agreed, probably thinking she could manipulate the therapist into taking her side. My husband and I were in a weird limbo. We were still together, still working on things, but the foundation had cracks we couldn't ignore. He admitted in one of our sessions that he had been trained his entire life to prioritize his mother's feelings over everyone else's, including his own. Breaking that programming was excruciating for him. Some days he resented me for forcing the issue. Other days he thanked me for saving him from becoming his father. We were both emotionally exhausted. The first family therapy session with my mother-in-law was scheduled for month 8. I wasn't required to attend, but I wanted to be there. I wanted to see if she was actually doing the work or just performing contrition. The therapist was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had clearly seen every manipulation tactic in the book. She started by having my mother-in-law acknowledge specific behaviors that had been harmful. My mother-in-law tried to minimize and deflect. The therapist called her out immediately. It was almost satisfying to watch. Over the next few months, there was slow, painful progress that felt like watching a glacier move. My mother-in-law wasn't magically transformed into a warm and supportive person who baked cookies and offered unconditional love, but she started taking actual accountability instead of just defending herself with an arsenal of excuses and justifications. She stopped beginning sentences with, "I'm sorry you felt that way," and started saying, "I'm sorry I did that." The difference seemed small, but it was monumental. She wrote apology letters to me, my sister-in-law, and my brother-in-law's first wife, letters that her therapist made her rewrite multiple times until they contained actual acknowledgement of harm instead of veiled blame. The letter to the first wife came back unopened with a note saying, "I appreciate the gesture, but I've moved on and don't wish to reconnect." Fair enough. That woman owed us nothing, and her boundary was as valid as any of ours. She attended supervised family dinners where the therapist was present to intervene if old patterns emerged. She bit her tongue when she wanted to criticize. She asked before giving advice instead of just dictating. She respected boundaries when people said no. It was awkward and uncomfortable and sometimes felt forced, but it was happening. My father-in-law didn't immediately move back home. He said he needed to see sustained change, not just good behavior until she got what she wanted. My mother-in-law was furious about this at first, then resigned, then eventually accepting. Her therapist apparently told her that her husband's caution was reasonable given decades of broken promises to change. That reality check seemed to land. 18 months after the exclusion from the family cabin trip, my husband and I planned our own trip to Maui. This time together as a united front, as partners who had survived a war zone and come out on the other side. It felt symbolic somehow, reclaiming that place that represented my breaking point and transforming it into a place of healing. We booked the same resort I had stayed at with my best friend, got the same ocean view room, even requested the same beach chairs if possible. The staff probably thought we were crazy, but indulged us anyway. The night before we left, around 9:30 when I was finishing packing, my mother-in-law called. My hand hovered over the phone for a solid 10 seconds, old reflexes making me want to ignore it, new hope making me curious about what she wanted. Not to demand anything or criticize my packing choices or suggest I bring a sweater because you never know about the evening temperatures, but to say she hoped we had a wonderful time and she was sorry for everything that led to me going alone the first time. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was genuine. I could hear the effort in her voice, the rehearsed quality that said she had practiced what to say with her therapist. We spent a week in Maui, and it was different from the first trip. Less defiant, more peaceful. We talked a lot about what we wanted our marriage to look like moving forward, whether we wanted kids and how we would protect them from toxic family dynamics, whether we wanted to stay in the same city as his family or move somewhere fresh. Big questions without easy answers. My husband thanked me one night for not giving up on him, even when he didn't deserve the patience. He said I could have just left after that cabin incident, and it would have been justified. But I stayed and fought for us. Even when fighting meant setting boundaries he found painful. He said he was becoming the man he wanted to be instead of the man he was raised to be. And that was only possible because I refused to accept less. On our last day, we were watching the sunset from the beach when my phone rang. It was my mother-in-law. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. She wasn't calling to insert herself into our vacation or demand updates. She just wanted to say she was thinking of us and hoped we were happy. That was it. No manipulation, no guilt trip, just a simple statement. I thanked her and hung up. My husband asked if that was his mom, and I nodded. He said, "Progress is weird, isn't it?" And I agreed. It was weird. After everything that happened, after all the pain and confrontation and hard boundaries, here we were receiving a normal phone call from someone who used to be a nightmare. It wasn't perfect redemption or a fairy tale ending, but it was something. We flew home 2 days later. My brother-in-law texted that his mom had asked if she could come to his daughter's birthday party instead of expecting the party to revolve around her schedule. My sister-in-law reported that her mother-in-law actually apologized for a critical comment she made about the house being messy, catching herself mid-sentence. These tiny moments of self-awareness were accumulating into something that resembled actual change. My father-in-law moved back home after 20 months of separation. He said he did it with eyes wide open, knowing that people can relapse into old patterns. But the woman who came home to wasn't the same woman he left. She had done real work, confronted real demons, and made real changes. Was she perfect? No. Did she sometimes slip into old habits? Yes. But she caught herself now, apologized, and corrected course. That was more than she had ever done before. The family dynamic was permanently altered. My brother-in-law and his wife maintained stricter boundaries than before. Sunday dinners were less frequent and had clear time limits. Drop-ins were prohibited. Criticism was met with immediate consequences. My mother-in-law chafed against these restrictions sometimes, but she followed them because the alternative was losing her family entirely. My relationship with my mother-in-law would never be warm and fuzzy. We were cordial, respectful, sometimes even pleasant. But there was a distance that probably wouldn't ever fully close, and I was okay with that. I didn't need her to be my best friend. I needed her to respect my boundaries and treat me with basic decency. She was capable of that now, and it was enough. My husband and I celebrated our 3rd anniversary with a small dinner at home. We had been through more in 3 years than some couples experience in a lifetime. He still sometimes struggled with guilt about the cabin incident and everything that followed. His therapist was helping him work through the childhood conditioning that made him prioritize his mother over his wife. It was a process, and I was learning to be patient with that process while maintaining my own boundaries. Looking back at that first cabin trip, at the moment when I was told I wasn't really family, I could see how it was simultaneously the worst and best thing that could have happened. Worst because it revealed the toxic undercurrent I had married into. Best because it forced everything into the open before years of slow poisoning did irreparable damage. I had seen what happened to the first wife, how decades of manipulation destroyed her completely. I refused to be another casualty. People often ask me if I regret how I handled things, if I would do it differently, knowing what I know now. The honest answer is complicated. I could have been more diplomatic, less confrontational, more willing to compromise. But every woman who came before me tried the diplomatic route, and they all ended up damaged or divorced. Sometimes the only way to win is to refuse to play by rules designed to make you lose. My mother-in-law would never fully understand the harm she caused over the years. Her apologies, while genuine in their way, came from a place of wanting to keep her family together, rather than truly grasping the devastation she left in her wake. But I had learned that waiting for perfect understanding was futile. People change incrementally, imperfectly, with backsliding and setbacks. The question wasn't whether she became a different person overnight. The question was whether the changes she made were enough to coexist safely. The answer, 3 years later, was a cautious yes. She wasn't the villain of my story anymore, just a woman who had done terrible things and was slowly learning to do better. I wasn't the victim anymore either. I was someone who had faced down a toxic system and come out intact on the other side. Not unscathed, but intact. That distinction mattered. My best friend, who had been there for that first Maui trip when everything exploded, asked me recently if it was all worth it. The confrontation, the pain, the year plus of family drama and therapy and hard conversations. I thought about it for a long time before answering. It was worth it because the alternative was slow suffocation. It was worth it because I learned I was strong enough to stand alone if necessary. It was worth it because my husband learned his mother's approval wasn't worth more than his wife's respect. It was worth it because we broke a generational pattern that had destroyed multiple women. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. Was it hard? Unimaginably so. Would I recommend this path to someone else? Only if they were prepared to lose everything and rebuild from scratch. But for me, for us, it was the only path that led somewhere I actually wanted to be. Sometimes I think about the woman I was on that driveway, waving goodbye to a family that didn't want me there. She was hurt, but hiding it. Angry, but swallowing it. Scared of making waves. I wish I could tell her that the waves she was about to make would nearly drown her, but she would learn to surf them instead. I wish I could tell her that standing up for herself wouldn't be a single heroic moment, but hundreds of small, exhausting confrontations. I wish I could tell her that the man she married would surprise her, both with his failures and his eventual growth. Mostly, I wish I could tell her that she was enough. Exactly as she was, without producing grandchildren or earning approval or fitting into someone else's definition of family. She was enough, and she was about to prove it to everyone, including herself. The Maui sunset from 3 years ago lives in my memory as the moment I decided to stop accepting unacceptable treatment. Every sunset since has been a reminder that I kept that promise to myself. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but consistently. And in the end, consistency is what changes everything.